Hello, thank you. Thank you for joining me for Talmud study today. Really appreciate being here, whether in person or online. Thank you for joining us for our first installment of learning Talmud together, which is going to be really, really wonderful. And we're really excited to jump into this new tractate Shabbat for us at least. And hopefully, what we'll be doing is going through this discussion and trying to understand the rabbinic values behind discussion, not just to understand what the law is or what the halacha is, but to try to unearth what are the Jewish values behind this particular text. Whenever we learn Talmud, I think it's important to remember what Talmud is and what it isn't. Um, Talmud was a document, really a recording of discussions that happened in a Beit Midrash that actually happened between students within the times between 200 CE and 500 CE. They are a response to what is called the Mishnah, which was the first organized writing down of what is called the oral law. It's believed that not only did God give us the written law, or the Torah, which is the five books of Moses at Mount Sinai, but also gave us the oral law, which is a collection of oral laws of how we actually practice our Judaism. For example, the Torah could say something like, you should rest on the Sabbath. But when it comes to questions of what does rest mean and what are we really refraining from on Shabbat specifically, and what time does Shabbat start and what time does it end? And very practical questions like that are all answered within the oral Torah tradition. And that's why the oral Torah is so, so very important. Um, Now, it's important certainly for practical questions, but I think really what underlies the Talmud is really how the Talmud tries to resolve conflicts between different rabbis who think different things, and how to, in the end, the bigger idea of how to make decisions, right? How to make decisions as a Jew. And I think that's one of the major things that the Talmud really teaches, which is how to make decisions as a Jew with Jewish values. When asked the question, what are Jewish values? It's actually a pretty hard question to say, what is a Jewish value and what isn't a Jewish value? The best way to answer that, I believe, is through learning Talmud and trying to isolate the values that come out of the texts. And then we can apply the Talmudic discussion not only to the situation in which it's particularly discussing, but also to zoom outwards and think in a more meta fashion how these values and this way of making a decision would reflect in other decision-making capacities. A lot of times, I think when we learn Talmud, it will feel like we're zooming very, very, very close in to really understand the details of what is being said and what is not being said in the particular sugya or discussion. And then we'll hopefully be able to zoom out and say, what are the ramifications of this detailed practical discussion in the realm of more general values of how we make decisions. All right. We'll walk. I'll walk you through Sugya together. We'll learn it together, and we'll discuss it as it goes. Um, we are putting this. If you're watching on Zoom, the text will be available for you on a screen. And if you're here in person, obviously you can have. We have handouts for you. And if you're watching on Facebook, also you can also look on the screen. If you're listening to this through podcast, we've linked the text sheet to the episode details in the podcast. But also feel free to not look at the sheet if you're driving, if you're walking your dog. Feel free to listen to the shiur, and I'll try to speak in a way that you will be able to understand even without looking at a text sheet. So it's your choice of how you want to learn today. All right, let's begin. Of course, let's begin by sharing the text on the screen so you can see what we're talking about. Just give me 1 second as we do that with the technology. Okay, you should be looking at my screen now. All right. Just bringing up my account here so you can see the screen here. Sorry. All right, we've made it. Here we go. Good, wonderful. Let's this out. All right, wonderful. Well, so nice to be here with you today, um, and so nice to be learning. I entitled this series of classes really Rabbinic Power and Jewish Values, Jewish Decision Making, because I think what we want to focus on in this particular sugya is, and the big question sort of that's in the back of my head is what do the rabbis, these theological leaders and judges, what kind of power do they have to make decrees, to make laws, right? Obviously, the rabbis can't make anything up and say, you have to do this, you can't do this. But rabbis have the power to make things called gezerot, or decrees. The definition of what a gezerah is, or a decree is a rule that's made that is not explicitly said or called for or commanded in the Torah itself, but is a rule that the rabbis of the time felt necessary to make for the community, so that it could protect and create a fence around the values and the commandments of the Torah themselves. So it's nice to think of a gezerah as an extra fence around the Torah that our wise sages made a long time ago, again, to keep us from transgressing. And of course, that is a large power that rabbis can make laws and the Jewish people have to listen to them, right? We have a specific mitzvah in the Torah that says that you have to listen to the shoftim, the judges, in your time. Deuteronomy, it says that. And our sages read that as the sages, who are the judges in its time, have the power to make decrees for the Jewish people. But obviously, this power should be limited because there's a very big difference between God saying that we have to do something in the Torah versus the rabbi saying that you have to do something. That is a different level, number one. Number two, and the Jewish people, the Talmud and the Torah literature always finds it necessary to understand the source of where the ruling comes from. Does it come from the Torah or does it come from the sages? It's very important for the rabbis to understand where that's coming from. So the way we'll do this is that I will begin in the Hebrew and I will translate in the Hebrew, but the text sheet itself has both Hebrew and English. So we'll try to fit the Hebrew and English of whatever we're reading at the same time, if it allows in my screen. Okay, I want to move myself off for a second. So the Talmud always, and many of the great sugyot or discussions of the Talmud always begin, or almost always begin, with the Mishnah, right? Or an earlier piece of material. The Mishnah was a document that was recorded between the years of 0 and 200 CE in the land of Israel, and was redacted by a great rabbi named Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. So we'll first study the Mishnah, and then we'll learn the Talmud that's based on this Mishnah. Let's dive in. This is a Mishnah from Tractate Shabbat. It begins, Lo yetzei achayit b'machato smuch l'chasheka, shema yishkach v'yetzei. The tailor, it's a chayat, the tailor may not go out with his needle when it's close to darkness. When it's close to darkness. Why? Shema, lest one forgets and goes out. The Mishnah itself doesn't say more explicitly what this is referring to, but I think this allows us to infer what is being talked about here, at least in a general level. We'll learn more details as we learn Talmud and as we learn the great commentaries of Rashi and Tosafot upon our Talmud. But from a general perspective, I think what is being said here is that on Shabbat, there is a specific prohibition that forbids us from carrying any objects from a private domain to a public domain. From a private space, one's own private space, or another person's private space, to what they call a public domain. So just to give you an example of this, for example, walking out one's door of one's house. When you're inside of your house, you're in your own private domain. It's fenced around by walls and a house. And when you walk outside of it, you're out into the world again. You're maybe out on the street, and you're in public domain. Those would be considered two different domains. And it is actually forbidden and considered a prohibited work on Shabbat to carry any object from the inside of one's house to the outside, right, into the street. That's just one example of how this works, right? And now you might think that Shabbat work is really about lifting something very, very heavy, right? Or something that you're really working hard, you're really sweating in order to do something. But that's actually not the case. The rabbis or the Torah actually prohibits every kind of object, even the smallest of objects, like a needle, right, that you really don't have to work hard to carry, right? Also Torah counts as carrying. It's one of the reasons actually we're told before Shabbat one should empty out their pockets to make sure there's nothing in their pockets so one's not mistakenly carrying something on Shabbat. So what this Mishnah seems to be saying, and I say seems to be because, again, this is just a guess. We have to really look into the Talmud and Rashi and Tosafot and what our great sages say to understand the truth of what this Mishnah is actually being said. It's kind of written in shorthand, is that the tailor should not go out with his needle close to darkness. Now, is it prohibited for the tailor to carry a needle on or before Shabbat? Before Shabbat actually begins? The answer is, I hope you were able to get this one, yes, it is very much permitted for a tailor to be able to go out before Shabbat with his needle, right? Why? Simply because it's not Shabbat yet. There is no prohibition yet for carrying a needle. And so the Mishnah seems to be prohibiting something that the Torah doesn't specifically prohibit, which is carrying a needle when it's not Shabbat, which usually you would think is permitted, but for some reason, the Mishnah seems to be saying a person should not do this when it gets close to darkness. Now, what darkness is it talking about? It's talking about the coming on of Shabbat. Shabbat begins in the evening at sunset, at a time called Shkiat Achama, or sunset. And so what the Mishnah is telling us, seemingly, is that one shouldn't leave one's house or leave one's private residence and go out into the street with a needle in his hand, or at least the tailor shouldn't, right? Lest they forget and go out. Now, this is going to, the Tosafot and many commentators will argue over what it means and what exactly are we forgetting. But from a simple sense, something is forgotten, and the tailor is going to end up carrying the needle actually on Shabbat, right? Because he just has it on him from before, right? And then he is violating Shabbat. So what this seems like a way of the rabbi saying, don't do this permitted action, because if you do this permitted action, then you're going to end up probably doing the forbidden action. And this is a common rabbinic idea, right? This, again, is the reason behind rabbinic decrees of extending the amount of prohibited things beyond what the Torah specifically says, in order to keep a person far away from sin, because we know if once you have something in your pocket, let's say it's 5-10 minutes before Shabbat begins, and you forget that it's in your pocket, and you end up walking around, you're going to forget, and it's going to become Shabbat, and you'll end up violating Shabbat by carrying. And it's for that reason that the rabbis prohibit this. But I think before we go on to the next case the Mishnah is going to bring, I think it's important for us to zoom out very quickly, because you might say, I don't carry needles. I'm not a tailor. What does this have to do with me? Well, you're asking the right questions, because that's always an important question to say, what does this have to do with me in particular? And you're 100% right here. What this has to do with you in particular is the question of when you know something is wrong to do it, when you know that something you really don't want to do, what personal rules do you make for yourself to keep you far away from doing that thing? For example, right, you're trying to eat right, and you know there's this donut place that you really, really love. And every time you pass it, you have to go in and get that cooler or get that donut, whatever it is. And so you make a decision that you want to eat healthy, right? And you decide that you don't want to eat those donuts, or maybe only one donut a week or something as a treat on Shabbat. So really, the thing that you need to do is not eat the donuts. But you might decide, I'm going to change the route I get to work, so I don't travel past the donut shop, so I don't tempt myself to eat the donuts and go in and get a donut. So I might try to make sure I don't drive near the donut shop, right? And that would be the way we ourselves create fences for ourselves, so it gives us a greater likelihood so we can succeed with the mission of not eating as many donuts, right? It's the same thing and the same logic here. And sometimes our mind likes to make excuses for us. I only forbidden myself from eating donuts. There's no reason I can't drive past the donut place. And you're 100% right. There really is no specific reason why you would be forbidden to do so if that goal was important to you, right? But if you want to succeed, there is some extra rules that you should probably take in order to succeed in your project. And instead, of course, the goal of not eating donuts, the goal of the Torah is to follow the laws that God has commanded us. In this case, that we don't walk and travel from one domain to the other, from a private domain to a public domain, with an object in our hand, and therefore violate the laws of Shabbat rest, specifically the forbidden labor of carrying. Let's keep going. The Mishnah brings more examples. The next example that's brought is, he goes, velo halavlar bekul moso, and not the scribe or the writer with his quill, or kulmos, right? People wrote with quills back then. And so the writer, or the person who writes, or scribe or something like that, shouldn't go out with his pen, right? Or his quill. This is a similar case to the case of a tailor, another professional craftsman, going out with their tool before Shabbat begins. And we're just like the previous example, that one of the assumed, at least seeming reason to not do this is because lest you forget, right, that you have this object on you and Shabbat begins, and then you're carrying it on Shabbat and you're doing a violation when you didn't intend to, right? Make sense so far? Good. All right. If anyone who is here has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. I always love questions, are very important here. So I'm going to keep going unless you have a specific question that you want to ask. Give 2 seconds. All right. Well, feel free to interrupt me anytime if you do have questions. Why don't we keep going? I think these two cases are pretty clear and make a lot of sense. So let's keep going. The next passage is a little bit different. And I think it's important to identify how the Mishnah moves from one subject to another, why the Mishnah makes that decision, and what that means for the different cases. Most importantly, we have to understand that the Mishnah is changing courses slightly. Let's take a look. The Mishnah continues, Velo yifale et kela, velo yikra leor haner. Right? And a person should not, the way this is translated in the translation here, as you can see, I'll move down, is that one may not shake his clothes, right? Shake the clothes. And one may not read a book by candlelight, right? Now we have these beautiful reading lights that you could put on your book, and I love those. I depend on them very much. But back then, when you would read and you wanted to read at night specifically, you would have to read by candlelight. Now, one of the interesting, what about the first case? But what's the deal with shaking the clothes? That's kind of a weird thing. Well, we'll learn in a minute what that means. Rashi will actually tell us a lot more about what that particular means, and we'll get, once we look at the commentaries to this particular text, they'll shed a lot more light on what we're talking about. And we're going to look at those next. So let's leave that as a question right now. We don't really know what shaking, why do you shake the clothes or taking off the clothes? It's a very weird phrase. But as we assume that it's a similar case in the case of someone reading a book by candlelight. Now, we don't really know what the problem is with reading a book by candlelight. And for that reason, we need to look to commentaries to understand why that's the case. So let's go and look down a little bit, and let's look down below this into Bartanura. Bartanura is one of the famous medieval commentaries on the Mishnah, and Rashi is probably the most famous commentator on the Gemara or the Talmud itself. So just to go down, because I really think we have to go down a little bit to understand what's going on here. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't include this particular comment, so I'll just say it then. So what is the case that's specifically being talked about here is the case in which one is removing, for the case of shaking the clothes, it's about removing bugs from one's clothing on Shabbat, right? Now, this would be something that would be very problematic for a specific reason, according to Rashi and according to many of the commentators, not because of getting the bugs off your shirt. There's nothing wrong with that, or there's no problem with shaking your clothes specifically. But the problem is that you need a light to see the bugs, to get them off, right? To see where the bugs are. So you might put your clothing near a candle, which is a similar case to someone reading a book who's going to want to be near a candle so they could see the different the words, and just as we do when we try to squint and see small letters through light. Now, what's the problem with this? Is it forbidden to read by a candle on Shabbat? Well, maybe. Why? What might be the problem of reading on Shabbat near a candle? The Torah doesn't prohibit it. The Torah says there's nothing wrong with reading on Shabbat, and there's nothing wrong with sitting near an already lit candle. What the Torah has a problem with is igniting new flame on Shabbat, right? The actual course of ignition. There were some Jews who had originally thought that when the Torah said you cannot have a fire in your domain, it meant that there can be no fire that ever exists inside your domain. That was the practice of a Jewish breakaway community called the Karaites in that regard. But the rabbis have chose a different course to say having a fire in your domain is permitted. It is permitted to have this. It just can't be ignited itself on Shabbat, right? So you can have it, but you can't actually light it. And that's why we light Shabbat candles On Shabbat, before, right, we light the candles before Shabbat actually begins at candle lighting time, which is usually 18 minutes before Shabbat traditionally, right? But we're supposed, the purpose of doing that is so that the candles stay lit during Shabbat and that we have light in the house. So the whole entire purpose of Shabbat candles is using light. So what is the problem that's being said here? Why does the Mishnah have a problem with someone reading by a candle or cleaning out their clothes from bugs or whatever it may be on Shabbat near a candle? What's the problem with this? Well, it's another rabbinic addition or gezerah or decree around the laws of the Torah themselves. What the rabbis are worried about is you're not going to be, maybe there's going to be a happenstance where you just can't make out the words or you just can't see the bugs on your shirt or what have you. And you'll first maybe try to move the book closer to the candle, but then you might want the flame itself to be a bigger flame. And so what you used to do is you used to tilt the candle slightly so that the wax or the oil would move closer to the wick, right? And ignite the flame ever so much more and make that light more powerful. And then you get a stronger light so you can see the book or you can see the candle in this regard, right? And now what's the problem with doing that on Shabbat? Well, technically, even if the candle's already lit, every time that if you move the candle and you tilt it over, and because of that, the wet wax moves over or the oil moves onto the wick, you're actually causing, by your own force, for that candle to reignite, right? And that is the action that's actually forbidden. And of course, this is something that we do. Imagine you and your book like on Shabbat and you can't see that little word. What might you do? Without even thinking about it, you might, oh, I'm going to move the lamp a little bit, or I'm going to move this slightly so I can read. You're busy thinking about the book or the task that you're doing with the light. You're not thinking about the light specifically. You're just using the light. So you might, without thinking, move that lamp, right? And the rabbis were concerned that Jews would do this with their candles and on mistake, again, violate Shabbat. That is the reason for the gezerah here, or the decree that the rabbis are saying here, right? But I think it's important to understand how the Mishnah moves, right? The first case of the tailor and the case of the scribe, we have a case where specifically those two professions, those two examples, are before Shabbat actually begins. The rabbis are actually making a prohibition, right, for the Jewish people for actually before Shabbat even begins. This is different than the case of cleaning out one's clothes or reading a book near a candle, right? Because if you can actually do those things before Shabbat, right? You can do those things as long as you know you're going to finish them relatively quickly, right? Because again, that's not a problem before Shabbat, right? To shake your clothes, use the candlelight, what have you. Those things aren't permitted. But on Shabbat itself, even though these actions are permitted on Shabbat themselves, the rabbis choose to forbid them, right? Because you might come to violate a Torah sin. Unlike the cases of the tailor and the scribe, who doing those actions on Shabbat itself would themselves be forbidden, right? If the tailor takes his needle out on Shabbat, or the scribe takes out their pen or their quill on Shabbat from one domain to another, that would be a violation on Shabbat. So that is not a rabbinic, on Shabbat itself, that is not a rabbinic decree, right? Unlike the case here of shaking the clothes or reading the book, both near a candlelight, in those cases, doing those activities on Shabbat themselves would not be a violation of Torah law, but they would be a violation of rabbinic law because a fence was created around the Torah law, lest you break a Torah law, as we're seeing here. Now, the Mishnah is going to now take a step back on the example of candlelight, and specifically use of candlelight when reading. So we'll take a step back here. So I can't fit the Hebrew and the English in one screen. I'll have to work on that for next time. So we'll choose to keep the English here. The Mishnah continues. Be'emet amru. However, in truth, they said an established halacha, right? They said an established law. So what they're saying here is like just as when we say in truth, you're making a little disclaimer, right? A little bit of a wrinkle in this specific case. Hachazan roeh heichan tinokot horim. What we would usually say, the cantor, doesn't mean that here. We're no cantors 2,000 years ago in this way. But they're here, what the word here means, a teacher or some kind of reader or something like that, right? The translation given in Sefaria here is the attendant. So the attendant sees where the kids are reading. Now, what kids are these? When this is actually the students in which the attendant is teaching. So they're teaching the children, right? And the children are reading in their books, and they review the parsha. It used to be that they would review what the congregation is going to read even before Shabbat begins. So what we learn is the attendant who's teaching the reading to the children uses the candlelight so that he can see where the children stopped reading. But the rabbis seem to believe, and we'll again look at Rashi and look at the commentaries in perspective to understand how they're saying this. But they're specifically saying this because there's an idea that when a teacher is around students, they're going to be extra cautious not to break Shabbat and not to break a rule of the Torah, because that's what they're trying to teach in the first place. So if by teaching they were breaking a law of the Torah on mistake, right, that would be teaching the students the exact opposite of what they're trying to teach, right? And that would just be bad teaching. And the rabbis assume that a teacher or a good teacher would not do that. So therefore, they permit the teacher to be very close to the candle, more close than normal in terms of reading, in order to fulfill this task, right? Because they're not afraid that the teacher is going to mistakenly tilt the candle or something like that. I think it's worth zooming out just for one moment to realize the meta value behind it. In a small, detailed wrinkle of a decree that they already made, we see a really important meta value of what it means to be a teacher. Oftentimes, what a teacher wants to teach is they think is the content of what they are trying to teach, and they sculpt a lesson based around those educational goals in which they're trying to achieve, right? So the teacher then tries to teach a particular detailed area of subject matter, but oftentimes because they're so focused on a detailed subject matter, they forget about the bigger picture. And because of that, the students don't learn the right thing. For example, let's say in Hebrew school or in a Jewish youth group, the counselor or the teacher says to the students, it's time to say the blessing over the food we're going to eat. It's time to say Birkat Hamazon or a blessing like that, to thank God for the food we eat. And the teacher really cares deeply about the kids saying the blessing and wants the kids to learn the blessing and say the blessing, because blessing food after we eat it is a Torah law and something that we should strive to do. And that's what the Torah is teachers trying to educate. And so they decide, the teacher saying that the students are going to say Birkat Hamazon, or the blessing after eating a meal, after they eat bread during snack time. Now, it becomes that time for the students to say Birkat Hamazon, and they start singing the melody. But one of the students realizes that the teacher is not saying Birkat Hamazon. She's busy grading a paper or looking at her phone or his phone or what have you, and not paying attention to saying the blessing themselves. The conclusion that the student will make, even a young student will say, well, must not be serious. This teacher must not be serious that this is what you should do or this is what God does, because they're not being a good dugma, they're not being a good example of how a Jew should behave. And which is why it's so important for the teachers and the attendants and anybody who's with students at a time when they're trying to learn a subject like this to enthusiastically sing Birkat Hamazon with the students, so that the students not only learn how to say the blessing, which is of course important, but get the bigger meta lesson that this is serious, that this is real, that this is important. This is not something that just kids do, but it's something that adults should do as well. Kids usually want to do the things the adults do and take seriously. Very important. And so here we see that the rabbis have this implicit assumption that if someone is teaching students, that they're going to be very careful with their behavior to make sure that they don't mistakenly break Torah law, mistakenly in trying to teach the students something else. The students are obviously not going to think that Torah is very important that you're trying to teach them if while you're teaching them, you're breaking the Torah by igniting flame. And so the Mishnah assumes that a teacher would be very, very careful as not to do this. I love the way the rabbis think of teachers, and they give us this beautiful advice of how to be a teacher in the world, right? Just through this simple expression. Let's finish the Mishnah and together. So you see that he adds this one last caveat. However, he himself may not read, right? So this is important because when the teacher's alone and doing the same act, that act would then be considered forbidden, or the rabbis make offense around that. Why? Because they know the teachers on special, more thoughtful behavior of their actions and really watching themselves when they are around their students. Less so when they're alone and just going about their life. Right? So it's not like teachers just have an exemption now. They could read candles. It's only in the specific situation when they're in front of the class. Let's do the last example together. Similarly, it says in English, but in Hebrew, Lo yochal hazav im hazava. The zav should not eat with the zava. Mitnei hergel avira, because in doing so, they may become accustomed to transgression, to sin. Now, probably the big question on your head, what are those italics? What's a zav and what's a zava? So oftentimes, I don't translate Hebrew words that is worth it that you just know in the original language, and they don't really have a synonym in English. So let's explain a little bit about what a zav and a zava means. Come with me. The zav and a zava are people who are in a specific situation of ritual impurity. A specific situation of ritual impurity. And that's when they have something coming out of their body that usually does not come out of the body, right? Or that is not the typical thing, right? We're not talking about going to the bathroom here or in any way, but let's say pus from a wound or something like that. And oftentimes what's being talked about here is someone who has fluid come out of their private parts in this regard, usually stemming from some kind of sexual act. A zav is the male version of this, and the zava is a female version. Now, it's important to know that being a zav or being a zava, being in a state of ritual impurity due to your body emitting a particular substance, is not morally wrong. It is not morally wrong to be impure or pure, but rather one is what was called ritually impure or ritually pure. What this means, in effect, is that one can't enter holy spaces when one is in a state of ritual purity or ritual impurity. Specifically, what is originally meant is the the domain of the temple in Jerusalem, the holy temple in Jerusalem. One could not offer sacrifices or enter the holy temple while in a state of ritual impurity. This is the breaking of a Torah violation. To enter the temple in a state of ritual impurity is a Torah violation. Now, the rabbis made a decree on this, saying specifically that, therefore, right, a zav and a zavah should be very careful to eliminate their impurity, which is done in a variety of different ways, usually involving immersion in a mikveh or a ritual bath, right? So they should try to purify themselves as soon as they can. Why? Because a Jew should always be ready to enter the temple and offer sacrifices. But specifically in this case, they're saying a zav may not eat with his wife, the zavah. Now, usually, what this seems to be being talked about here is that there's a fear that if an impure person is eating with a pure person, through the eating of the food together and through the being together, they might make contact with each other and therefore impurify each other. That the impure person will impurify the pure person, right? That happens through touch, right? And sexual acts as well, right? So it's very important that a ritually pure person does not eat together with a ritually impure person for fear that the ritually pure person may therefore get into becoming sexually becoming impure. So here the rabbis even go one step further than that, and they say specifically, even the case of an impure person should not eat with another impure person. Now, why would you think that this would be permitted? The reason is why you say, well, two people with the same cold, or two people with the same flu, or two people with the same disease, even if it's very contagious, there's no problem with them eating together. Why? Because, well, they can't get the disease again that they already have, right? They already have the disease. Therefore, they don't need to quarantine with those people in the same way. It's the same thing with ritual purity and impurity. Once you are ritually contaminated, you can't become ritually contaminated again, right? You're either contaminated or you're either pure or you're impure. Two statuses, right? So you might think that a zav and a zavah can eat together, right? Because there is no chance of them impurifying each other. A male and a female can eat together. Now, why then do the rabbis say this? And they actually give the reason here why they shouldn't eat together, right? And specifically in this case, a man and his wife, right, eating a meal together, right? Why? Because they might become accustomed to sin, right? Now, the danger here is that the zav and the zavah will touch each other or even have sexual relations, right? Because they're near each other, right? Which would technically be permitted because again, they're not taking on ritual impurity by doing this. But the rabbis seem to forbid it here. Why? Because if they are used to having sexual relations or contact when they are both ritually impure, they're going to be getting in the habit of saying, even though I'm ritually impure, I can have sex or I can be in contact with my partner in that regard. And they might get in the habit of doing that, and they might then mistakenly do that even in the case where one of them is ritually impure and one of them is not ritually impure, and therefore actually contaminate the other person. Now, the question that's going to come up here is, these are all rabbinic decrees. Every law that's stated here is not prohibited by the Torah itself, but is prohibited by the wisdom of the rabbis to keep us far away from transgressing. All of these are examples of decrees, of laws that are made beyond the bounds of the Torah. So this Mishnah is a great example of a bunch of ways the rabbis tried to put fences around the Torah to protect us from transgressing. We're obligated to follow them, right? But we should always understand that they are a fence. They're not Torah law itself. What the Sugya is going to analyze once we get into the Talmud, this is where the Mishnah finishes. What the Sugya is going to analyze, and we'll begin in our next class to look at first what the Tosafot, what the commentary is going to say on this particular Mishnah, and what Rashi says on this particular Mishnah. But we'll then move on to the Talmud afterwards, and what the Talmud has to discuss about this particular Mishnah, and what the main topic that's going to be discussed and that we're really going to focus on is when can rabbis make these laws? How far can you go to make these laws? Can you make a decree on anything? How close does it need to be to protecting one from violating Torah law for the rabbis to have the power and the authority to make extra rules and laws for the community? What are the limits, therefore, of rabbinic power? Those are the questions we're going to be focusing on in the Talmud, and the Tosafot, and Rashi in our next class, which will be on Tuesday at 10 a.m. Sorry, not Tuesday, Thursday at 10 a.m. You'll be able to find this material hopefully on YouTube and afterwards to watch afterwards if you would like to review, and also, of course, on our podcast. We'll try to do that and put that material up there as quickly as possible. Thank you for learning with me today. Thank you for being here, and happy Yom HaAtzmaut, happy Israeli Independence Day. Please feel free to come to my class this afternoon at 3 p.m. on the prophets. You can use the same link that we have for this class, our virtual Beit Midrash link. And please also do come to our Yom HaAtzmaut Israeli Independence Prayer Service, which begins at 6 p.m. today. It's going to be wonderful to celebrate Israel together. Please feel free to always email me at Rabbi Marcus Rubenstein at templeofaaron.org or rmr@templeofaaron.org. I'm always happy to receive your comments, your questions, and to continue the learning offline. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.